Hello, it's me.
There are many issues today that plague the minds of policymakers and the stability of the international system. These may include political strife, terrorist organizations, fight for the control of natural resources, human rights crimes, and environmental woes. Although these issues seem devastating on their own, they are even more crushing when they are dealt with simultaneously. Such is the case of the world's infant nation. And if you didn't know, well then, today we will discuss the world's newest nation, South Sudan. More specifically, we will address this question. How have human rights crimes, military tensions, and political instability affected the current and future economic stability of South Sudan? First, let us begin by briefly exploring the history of the state of South Sudan. Originally, they were a part of the state of Sudan. From the 6th century onward, Sudan was ruled by a variety of Christian and Islamic kingdoms. In the early 1820s, Muhammad Ali, no, not that Muhammad Ali, this Muhammad Ali, the Ottoman military leader of Egypt, launched a successful invasion of Sudan and essentially was able to annex the nation as a part of Egypt. This marked the beginning of Egyptian rule in Sudan. Egyptian influences weakened in the 1880s as a result of Sudanese rebels rising through the political arena. These were the Mahdist forces. These forces, driven by the fundamentalist doctrine of Muhammad Ahmad, the so-called Mahdi, or Messiah of the Islamic faith, which called for people to adopt Islam or be killed. They wished to expand their influence into other West African nations like Ethiopia and modern-day Eritrea. As Britain saw the weakening of Egyptian rule and the threat of other European nations intervening in Sudan during the midst of the scramble for Africa, they decided to aid Egyptian troops in the fight to reclaim Sudan. This became the Mahdist War. This established the Anglo-Egyptian colony of Sudan, which lasted from 1899 to 1955. The British and Egyptians together ruled the regions of the north and the south of Sudan differently. With the wave of decolonization in the 1950s, Britain and Egypt agreed to grant the Sudanese people independence in February of 1953. However, this sparked conflict between the two regions of Sudan because, since they had been run differently for so many years, each of the regions had their own ideas of governing and both wanted representation and autonomy in a new Sudanese state. This battle for representation sparked one of the bloodiest and longest civil wars in the history of all of Africa. On New Year's Day, 1956, the state of Sudan was established. Although independence should have brought a certain sense of nationalism and unity, Sudan was mired with civil war. The Sudanese Civil War lasted from 1955 to 2005, with an 11-year ceasefire between 1972 and 1983, and ended in a stalemate. In 2011, with great global support, particularly from the United States, South Sudan was granted independence from the state of Sudan. Even as the world celebrated the birth of a new nation that many predicted would prosper due to its strategic oil partnerships with China, and perhaps even the United States, South Sudan has really struggled to find its footing since its independence. The main reason for this issue is political instability. Furthermore, the several components to this include military tensions, crimes against humanity, and ethnic differences. Let's look a little deeper into modern-day South Sudan. Upon independence, Salva Kiir, an ethnic Dinka, became the nation's first president, while Riek Machar, an ethnic Nuer, became the nation's first vice president. Both were a part of the Sudanese People Liberation Movement, or SPLM. Immediately after independence, there was a fight for power between both men. In 2013, Salva Kiir accused Riek Machar of plotting a coup against him in order to become the president of South Sudan himself. This began the current South Sudanese civil war. Besides creating the civil war, this conflict split the SPLM and its military force in two, along ethnic lines. The SPLM, led by Salva Kiir, is a primarily Dinka group, whereas the SPLM in opposition, or SPLM-IO, led by Riek Machar, is primarily Nuer. This ethnic conflict transitioned greatly into military violence. Military violence plagued the entire nation. According to the African Development Group, as of November 2015, over 2.2 million people, an increase of 200,000 since the beginning of 2015, have been displaced. Over 1.6 million people have been displaced internally, while over 616,000 people have fled to neighboring states. This has greatly impacted the economic state of South Sudan. For one, they do not have the human power to engage in consistent agriculture. This has led to great food shortages. According to Action Against Hunger, in 2015, ongoing conflict worsened by crop deficits, shortages of basic food staples, and inadequate rain contributed to unprecedented levels of hunger and acute undernutrition. At the time of the printing of this report, 2.8 million people, nearly 25% of the country's population, urgently required food assistance to meet their basic survival needs, and at least 400,000 people in conflict zones faced a catastrophic hunger crisis. United Nations agencies warned that 5.8 million people, or nearly half of the country's population, were struggling with some sort of level food insecurity. This is a great human security concern, as historian Roland Paris describes in his 4-cell model of human security. Now for the greater economic consequences. After years of conflict, both sides signed a formal peace agreement in August of 2015, due to pressure from the United Nations, who threatened hefty sanctions on the state. One controversial measure of the peace deal is that it gives legitimacy to the rebel SPLM-IO and allows the establishment of 2 military forces. As stated in the document, the President of South Sudan shall head the South Sudan National Defense Forces. By the same token, the office of the first vice president will be established and will be selected by the leadership of the rebel group. Essentially, it means that Riek Machar will return to a certain degree of power in the government of South Sudan. This office is meant to ensure that the reforms of the peace agreement are implemented. It gives the first vice president control over the South Sudan armed opposition forces. This is a major issue that causes the great military tension. Because these 2 military forces are legitimized, each is inclined to align themselves with a certain political group. It implied that there would always be military conflict. This was just one of the faults of the agreement. This has greatly impacted the current economy of South Sudan. Here, we see the percentages of GDP that is spent on the military in South Sudan. They spend nearly 11% of their GDP on military in 2015. For a better sense of how much this is, the United States in 2015 spent only 3.3% of GDP on military. This is very alarming, especially considering the current GDP of the state of South Sudan. Their GDP in US dollars is about $9 billion. By comparison, the GDP of 2 of the more stable and prosperous nations in Africa, Nigeria and Kenya, are $481 billion and $63 billion respectively. In this graphic from the Global Terrorism Database, from the 42 reported terrorist incidents conducted by the SPLM-IO, close to 50% of these incidents have targeted private citizens and property, almost just as much as military targets. Interestingly, Salva Kiir's SPLA has not been credited with any terrorist acts since late 2011, although it is understood that the government forces themselves have engaged in egregious, violent behavior just as much as the SPLM-IO. Perhaps this could be justified using Bruce Hoffman's definition of terrorism as violence or the threat of violence used and directed in pursuit of or in service of a political aim. This military conflict leads into another issue that affects the economy: failing infrastructure. South Sudan has poor infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and housing capacity. Most roadways are unpaved. During South Sudan's rainy season, it makes roadways very slippery and dangerous, and therefore minimizes trade in the region. An interesting phenomenon that occurs because of this rainy season is a reduction in fighting because transportation is difficult. This causes a great shift in military battle during the dry season. This dry season brings many droughts and further exacerbates the hunger crisis. As much of the battle targets private property, houses are usually left in rubble. This does not help the grave problem of internally displaced peoples within South Sudan. It is very common for the military to seize school buildings as centers for military operations. This greatly affects children who are supposed to be in school. This is only one aspect of one of the most serious humanitarian crises in South Sudan: children soldiers. As we look at the population pyramid of South Sudan, we see an interesting phenomenon. The pyramid is very wide at the bottom and thins out consistently as it moves upward. This demonstrates that the population of South Sudan is mainly comprised of children. There is a far less number of working age adults, which could be pinpointed to many causes such as hunger, deaths due to military violence, or limited accessibility to healthcare. Many of these minors lose the opportunity to become educated, as militias overtake school buildings or destroy them altogether. If these kids are left orphaned due to the brutal killings exercised by the militia groups or diseases, they are even more susceptible to radicalization. According to the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, a total of 1,051 incidents affecting 28,788 children were documented in 2015 in South Sudan. If so many children are being forced to take up arms in the military, wherein they contribute little to the economy of the state, then the prospects for future economic growth in the state are reduced. There is little hope for the expansion of the economy outside of just an unstable oil industry, which relies on a highly sought after yet non-renewable resource. In 2014, and still to this day, petroleum oils and oils obtained from bituminous minerals account for 99.8% of South Sudan's exports, making it the nation with the most oil-dependent economy in the world. Without the revenue generated from oil exports, the state of South Sudan would fall apart. Such has been the case over the past year as oil prices around the globe have collapsed and have greatly affected a nation whose GDP is 60% oil revenue. The primary recipient of this oil is China. The Chinese essentially have a sort of stranglehold on the nation as they are the key customer of the South Sudanese oil business. However, they have done very little in terms of mediating the peace in the state. It seems that they benefit in this trade partnership more so if the state is in political turmoil, because the Chinese get a bigger bang for their buck. Looking towards the future, it appears that fighting will continue in the South Sudanese state. Not much is expected to change as they refuse the influx of a greater number of UN peacekeepers. The Chinese do not seem to be intent on helping alleviate the conflict, and there is still money to be made in the oil business. Hopefully this conflict ends one day, and South Sudan can become the stable, prosperous nation it was once hoped it would become. Until that day, the government of South Sudan will just be telling its people this.
Our people are actually, advised to leave us. Our people are actually given wrong information in order to leave South Sudan, when in actual fact there's no any better place for them anywhere. People of South Sudan are here better in South Sudan than in any other country in the world.